David Fincher is, without a doubt, one of the most highly regarded figures to come out of Hollywood in the 1990s. With his distinct embrace of cold-blooded and nihilistic filmmaking, that it served as a perfect contrast to many of the big-budget films of the time. It allowed him to carve out his own path to mainstream success and led him to become one of the biggest names in film today. Over the years, he has put out many films with a lasting impact. Some are great, and some not so great. So today, I am going to sort them out from worst film to best.
I'd gone to a brothel. I'd had my first drink, said goodbye to one friend, and buried another.
Just fuck off. I don't even know what to say about this one. Curious Case of Benjamin Button is a boring, sappy melodrama, plain and simple. It's an amazing looking movie, don't get me wrong. It's an amazing looking movie that tries to be an intriguing look at certain points of American history, kind of like Forrest Gump, doing this by having a man who is aging backwards serving as a voyeur in the story, looking into the world after World War I and how he falls in love with a girl in spite of his disease. The emotional parts of the film really lacked any potency, making the film just feel strange to watch. Like, the minor characters we meet along the way aren't really interesting. The film really tries to make you care about them, though, with their expansive backstories, but it just makes you say things like, "Oh yeah, I remember World War I," and "Aw, that's sweet," leaving you with a dull tug at your heartstrings that leaves no lasting impact. The performances themselves are nothing to write home about either. They do their job. This movie has got award bait written all over it. Yet it still won 3 Oscars, all of which relate to how it looks, which is gorgeous, by the way. It has a very rich and romantic look to it, and in my opinion, makes it the most redeeming quality of the film. It's just beautiful to look at, but somehow uninteresting to actually watch. I guess the one exception to the film's beauty is the effects on Benjamin Button himself have definitely aged in spite of being noteworthy for the time. It's needless to say we have seen so many better effects since then. Did I mention this film is 2 hours and 45 minutes long? All of which I felt numb to its heartwarming charm. It genuinely felt like an endurance test to sit through, which makes it understandable why I think The Curious Case of Benjamin Button is easily David Fincher's worst film to date.
You may never work in this town again, Mac.
Orson, please.
Do you care about politics of 1930s Hollywood for some reason? If you somehow answered yes, then Mank is the film for you. Mank follows the writing process behind the legendary film Citizen Kane, and how the writer, Herman Mankiewicz, was influenced by his real life, especially with his relationship with William Randolph Hearst, who Kane is loosely based off of. The plot weaves through the personal politics between the two of them and the actual writing process of Citizen Kane, all of which goes nowhere. The film takes some interesting directing choices, like opting for black and white cinematography and sporting dialogue that fits a film of that era, it's an admirable feat to pull off, recreating that era with that level of detail, but leads to lackluster results. Don't get me wrong, Mank utilizes the black and white well enough. That's the problem. It's just enough. It has very few standout shots or editing in it. I like some of the crossfades, and some of the shots were actually pretty evocative, but overall, there was nothing that left a huge impression on me. Same goes for the characters. Despite all the snarky remarks made between them, none of it helps to distinctly define any of them for me. Even the titular Mank just felt like some snobbish drunk who had enough of his wits about him to be occasionally snide in every conversation. Gary Oldman does a fine job at the performance of the drunk, as does everyone else, but that's the problem. It's just fine. Nothing special. Even the story itself is just fine. It meanders a bit, like with the one scene where all the influential characters of the day are just talking about the politics of 1940s. It goes on too long, and it just feels entirely unnecessary. So, it's needless to say, Mank felt like a story that is vaguely interesting as a tidbit of information, expanded on into a full feature, which in itself is an okay idea, but doesn't lead to a very memorable experience. To be honest, the most memorable thing about this movie was that Trent Reznor got an Oscar nomination for this film's score the same year he got one for Pixar's Soul. So it's kind of funny to see Trent Reznor go up against Trent Reznor. Don't worry, Trent was able to beat Trent, no problem.
Lieutenant Ripley! It's here! You got Clemens?
Stop this raving at once!
I'm telling you! It's here!
Well, this is a weird way to start your directing career, by handling one of the biggest names in science fiction, and deciding that you hate everything about it. Moreover, you just hate everything in general, and want to see the world burn. Alien Cubed is a film dedicated to being as grim and dark as possible, beginning with most of the cast of the previous film dying horribly. It seems to have a vendetta against aliens or the Alien franchise, or any idea of being attached to that whole thing, manifesting its pettiness by basically removing all the adventurous tone James Cameron was going for with Aliens, opting to make something incredibly bleak and unfeeling, full of moody images and dark industrial environments. It feels like there was a genuine effort to create a unique science fiction horror experience that was just miserably attached to the Alien franchise. However, it just falls short of being able to complete that vision. While the set design and cinematography conveys that nihilistic mentality that it tries to achieve, the rest of the film falls flat to live up to that ideal. The story really isn't that interesting, the action isn't as impressive as it was in Aliens, with the hostile atmosphere feeling underwhelming in comparison to Alien as well. All that seemed to work for it in this movie was the general tone that it achieved. I get why this movie is as hated as it is. In a franchise that has got two great films to start it, both of which managed to take it in completely different directions, it's weird to see it stumble on its third entry in comparison. It just feels so out of place for the direction that James Cameron was previously directing it in. So going into Alien 3 after Aliens would probably be a complete downer. It's kind of like when you and the boys are having a night out and you're having a good time, then someone decides to put Death Consciousness on the aux. Not bad by any means, but a complete vibe killer. Well, at least it wasn't written by Joss Whedon.
See you, Burnham. Later, Raoul.
This is probably the most generic of all David Fincher's films. While it is entirely competent, it lacks anything that makes it distinct or super interesting. It's a typical home invasion movie, following a single mother and her daughter moving into a new house only to have it broken into the night they move in, with three robbers trying to get into the panic room that the mother and daughter are hiding. While I wouldn't say there are any standout performances, the acting isn't what holds this movie back. Well, except for Jared Leto, who tries to method act, but misheard it completely, and now he can't stop fiending for Crystal. The thing that irks me the most about this film is all the plot contrivances that occur, like certain details popping up later in the film that make no sense being there, outside of the idea that the film just needed it to happen that way to have a climax, as well as the whole premise entirely hanging on the robbers being completely unaware that people were actually staying there, in spite of all the indicators showing otherwise, like the lights being on, making it completely obvious. It makes them seem entirely incompetent, which makes the cat and mouse game between the robbers and the residents a little too cartoonish. I also am not a huge fan of how this film is shot either. It's got too many over-exaggerated camera shots. I know that was a whole thing in the 90s and the 2000s, and some of David Fincher's films use similar effects more appropriately, but in this film, it feels entirely unnecessary. Like the intense molecule-level close-ups on certain items that serve no purpose but to try and add intensity, but it just looks tacky. Same goes for all the CGI as well. I also don't know if it was entirely necessary to have so many shots going through floors of the house either, besides the movie just wanting to show up. The lighting is pretty good though. It actually does a good job of divorcing the house from the rest of the world, while having lighting in the house have such a dark claustrophobia to it that it kinda adds to the film's overall mood and intensity. As a thriller, Panic Room works. It's entertaining enough, but really lacks the substance or interesting thrills to make it noteworthy. I'd say it's definitely good if you're just looking for something to watch that you don't want to think about, because the moment you do actually think about it, the plot holes just start pushing through. A solid film, but not anything special, especially in comparison to the director's other work, so that's why it's this low on my list. That and Funny Games has entirely ruined home invasion movies for me. Wait, who shut off the lights?
I'm concerned you won't like her. She's different.
With this film, it feels like a perfect storm of what should work for a David Fincher film. It's a stone-cold noir that's bleak, full of intense moments and intrigue, but for me, it just misses the mark of greatness. It's a film that makes sense on paper, having a director who is known for his bleak nihilism make a film adaptation of one of the most well-known Nordic crime books, but once it's put on screen, it has issues. Mainly, for me, the level of intrigue that is held throughout the film, which really felt like it was hard to be invested in throughout the film's runtime. It follows Michael, a journalist who has been hired to unravel a mystery buried in the family history of a wealthy tycoon, navigating through lies and forgotten past, all while avoiding danger found underneath. On a technical level, it's as precise as his other work, capturing the harsh Swedish tundra and all its brittle environments to a great degree of success. The Reznor-Ross score feels appropriate here too, with a lot of droning ambience amplifying those cold landscapes, even if the Led Zeppelin cover was entirely unnecessary. The acting is solid too, and even works in some of the more intense and disturbing moments of the film. When the girl with dragon tattoo arrives at those moments, it treats them with such stark intensity, with how it uses things like sound and especially visuals, that it can't help but tear you apart, with those scenes being undertaken with more realistic lighting and coloring to them than the rest of the film's sleek production. Again, my main hang-up with this film is the inability to get hooked by the story, which has some moments of intrigue and some unique developments, but it felt like this movie went on for too long, with the last 20 minutes or so feeling entirely unnecessary, except for to try and set up a sequel. The Girl with a Dragon Tattoo isn't a bad movie by any means, but to me it fell flat, and kind of felt like Fincher playing to his strengths, but not using them in any meaningful way. So to me, that's why it deserves this spot on my list.
Simple. Fuck.
Ah yes, we finally get to see the mind of a Smiths fan put to screen. The Killer is a movie that is more interesting than it leads on to be. It's a weird meditative reflection on the thoughts and actions of a contract killer who has to fight for his life and the life of his loved ones after he screws up a hit. In a way, The Killer feels like a self-reflection of all the cynical and nihilistic nature that is presented in all of his films. Especially Fight Club, with how extensive this film uses the main character's inner monologue to fill in gaps in the story, which provides a look into his inner workings. And that's where the weird part comes in, because despite how cool, calm, and collected his mantras are, he immediately contradicts them. It creates some great comedic timing from the very moment the hit goes wrong, and continues to be a reoccurring theme throughout the film, leading to plenty of comedic moments. There's also a lot of irony to be found in how the film uses the Smiths, now that I'm thinking about it, having this poetic and romantic music be the soundtrack to a cold-blooded killer with a nihilistic mantra. It's definitely a strange choice for sure. It's one among many of the film's contradictions that lead it to explore the philosophy of the killer play out in real scenarios. The action in the film serves as the avenue of exploration, and I have to say, it is well executed. While it may not be an over-the-top John Wick shootout, it's very deliberate in its action. Some of the violence being, at times, swift and abrupt, yet still having moments of suspense and intensity. Like when he breaks into someone's house and they have this intense fight. This fight is subtle enough to lack music, and it gives that intensity a whole lot of weight behind it. All of this film has a lot of deliberate weight behind it, and it feels like such an intentional choice that lets each of the actions the killer takes be absorbed by the audience, even if that makes the audience less engaged by the killer's more mundane actions. Yet it never shies away from them, and still chooses to be as methodically shot and composed as most Fincher films are. It may be well composed, but the main character is anything but. I feel that seeing him go through his routine and his process of breaking out of the contract with his employers leads to an interesting view on this type of story and this mindset that I'd never expect from Fincher. It feels like a self-reflection on his own filmmaking and storytelling. While it's not a deep exploration, it offers some new insights, making sense why it's number 7 on my list.
What is this?
This is your game, Nicholas, and welcome to it.
Right off the wild success of Seven, David Fincher decides for his next film, he would step back from the grotesqueness of that film, choosing to focus more on the brooding atmosphere with The Game. The Game follows Nick Van Orton, who receives an invite to an elusive game as a birthday present from his brother, sending him through a bizarre series of events as a result, with a barrage of cryptic messages, nameless assailants attacking him, and mass surveillance, which builds a heightened sense of paranoia in Nick's actions throughout the film, and sees cool facade he puts on slip away in an attempt to force him to self-reflect. The central performance of Michael Douglas is actually pretty good, playing along with the film's tone even as it gets pretty campy by the end, kind of like the film itself. Same with all the other actors. I think they play along with the game itself, feeding into that paranoia well. The cinematography looks incredible, bringing out the moody noir that San Francisco evokes incredibly well. This leaves me to discuss one of the big gripes people have with this film, and that is the ending and some of the actions leading up to it. While this may have spawned a lot of criticism at the time, I feel like this criticism is somewhat warranted. The shift in tone feels so out of left field that to have it become so over the top feasibly sours the entire film for some people, regardless of whether it completes the character or not. It feels a little tacked on. For me, I don't think it ruins the entire experience of watching The Game. It is still a great looking movie that has some good performances and some good thrills. While not a standout film in his filmography, it is enjoyable and didn't feel like it wasted my time. It also feels like a good palate cleanser after watching Seven, which was definitely needed.
I mean, you're insane. Why would you even want this? Yes, I loved you, and then all we did was resent each other and try to control each other and cause each other pain.
That's marriage.
Gone Girl is a great representation of the classic dilemma. Lazy manipulator BF versus crazy manipulator GF. Who wins? While it may be his most conventional film, it takes on the modern crime drama in an interesting way that explores the weird relationship dynamics that the male character, Nick Dunn, has with his wife, Amy. All of these character dynamics come to light when she turns up missing one day, on the day of their anniversary, putting it to the test while throwing them into their worst nightmare, full of unwanted press from the media and other weird interactions with people, exposing them to a world for which they cannot control. The film plays the missing person case as conventional as can be, following things as they all turn towards Nick while he tries to prove his innocence. That is to say, until they don't. Not to spoil anything, but the shift the film takes is one that flips the whole situation on its head, and at which point the film really grabs. It really throws you off and keeps you focused on the screen. Yet for some reason, for me, rewatching Gone Girl for the first time since seeing it in theaters, when this shift happened, the movie got a lot funnier for some reason. Not in the conventional sense, and not very often, but certain moments with one of the characters were so absurd I couldn't help but laugh a little, especially with all their little subtle actions. They're just so petty, it's genuinely hilarious. Even with that in mind, I don't think the tension was lost as the result of this comedy. The trial Nick Dunn has to go through in the court of public press is so unpredictable that I couldn't help but be attached to the screen watching it. Speaking of Nick, the performance by Ben Affleck kind of leaves a little bit to be desired. Like, I understand that this film has the actors deliver lines more flatly, but his performance specifically feels lacking to me. I get that he's supposed to be this exhausted husk of a man, which is in Ben Affleck's wheelhouse entirely, but it feels just too unemotional to me. There should be at least some emotion expressed, with some sense of clarity. And most of the time, those emotions are, but there are a few moments where it's pretty lacking, which in the grand scheme is such a minor complaint because, as usual, Fincher is hitting the nail square on the head with the technical aspects of the film, making the film feel incredibly modern, but presenting it with his moody and glossy visual style, especially with that more conventional score from Trent Reznor. But I can still see why this film was such a big movie on release, and how it continues to be so even today. So that's why it's number 5 on my list.
It's him.
How sure are you?
You can be sure.
In media today, the zeitgeist surrounding true crime is at its height, with a whole litany of books, podcasts, documentaries, and a whole assortment of stuff talking about the grisly details surrounding these terrible actions, which has manifested in this weird cultural obsession with. This is no better encapsulated than in David Fincher's film Zodiac, which tells the true story of the Zodiac Killer and the investigation that follows that strange string of murders that took place in the late 60s and early 70s in California. The investigation is broken into 3 stages. The active journalist's news reporting following Paul Avery, the cop, Dave Toshi, stuck with the aftermath of all the crimes, and the author/fanatic Robert Graysmith, all of whom become obsessed with the Zodiac Killer, leaving a lasting impact on their lives. It's as much about the tragic deaths at the hand of the Zodiac Killer as it is about the tragic obsession these 3 have with solving the case. It's actually quite riveting to watch the investigation unfold through these perspectives, and it catches you up in their obsession, especially considering how long this film is. It somehow manages to maintain the interest of a mainstream film-going audience despite having a longer runtime, with details being presented with such clarity that it informs you of all the loose odds and ends involved in the scenario. Fincher took time to make sure all the details were right and did his best to capture every minute detail. Some of these build on that sense of paranoia and dread the film gives off, even after these crimes are committed, with little details like the fixation with blue ink, the very same blue ink that the Zodiac Killer used in his letters. The killings themselves are handled pretty appropriately too, having them presented with realism and an eye for detail that makes you feel like you were actually there watching these horrible things unfold. It's terrifying, making those scenes feel like they were straight up pulled out of a horror movie. It's the mixture of stillness and abrupt violence that makes these scenes have such a lasting impact. The real-life terror and the media outcry about these killings is handled pretty well, especially with how it presents the relationship between the media and the detective work with the police, showing how they butt heads with one another, answering the question, how could publicity make the investigation better or worse? Zodiac really lives and breathes in the small things of the story, and it is such a great showcase of obsession and the effects it has. It pieces together the case and how it was formed, and all the forms that the obsession manifests. It handles the story pretty thoroughly, capturing not only the crimes, but also the lives of the investigators, especially Jake Gyllenhaal's character, Robert Graysmith, being a standout, since he doesn't have any stakes in the story at all. It's not as part of his job. He only gets invested in it because of a complete wanting to have the case finished. It's interesting to watch his focus on Zodiac intensify, even as the trail becomes colder over time, becoming so obsessed that he does it at the cost of his relationship. I could go on and on about this film. So yeah, it's needless to say that this film is great and definitely deserves this spot on my list.
It seems that envy is my sin.
Oh, what's in the box?
Sesevenin is when David Fincher really started to hit his stride, placing the cold nihilistic tone he attempted on Alien 3 into a noir story without that film's science fiction setting, making for one of the most unnerving detective stories to ever grace the big screen. The film follows a hotshot new kid on the block detective, Detective Mills, and his jaded partner, Somerset, as they follow and hope to catch a killer who carefully tries to recreate each of the 7 deadly sins, with each respective victim being representative of an individual sin. The story is very heavily involved with their investigation, allowing for the viewer to be taken along with them as they descend into the depraved mystery. I guess that brings me to the most memorable thing about this movie, for most people. Its gory and gross visuals, which I might add, still hold up. Their use in this film serves to reinforce the hellish feeling the film gives off, and is handled incredibly well throughout the runtime. Brad Pitt's horrible zingers withstanding, the film handles it as if it was a real crime and does not hold anything back from the viewer. Not to say the film is going for realism. It is clearly aiming for a bigger audience with the film's cold-cut, crisp presentation. It chooses a more conventional approach to cinematography, while adopting the moody set pieces that make noir films distinct. The main detectives that guide us through them leave a lasting impression despite the stereotypical young cop, old cop dynamic playing out. The character dynamic between Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman is actually one of the stronger points of the film. It illustrates the contrast between the hot-headed Mills and the cynical, cold Somerset, and how they handle this case, as well as how the things they witness compound over time and shape that cynical outlook Somerset has, which you can see take place in Detective Mills over the course of Brad Pitt's performance and their following of the Seven Killer, even as he lashes out in anger and remorse. Kevin Spacey does a good job playing Kevin Spacey. I don't have a joke there. He plays Kevin Spacey well. He plays the strange killer character fairly well, oddly well, and gives him a lot of leeway to work with, especially when it comes to his philosophy on human nature and the crimes that he commits and their meaning. I kind of like dialogue surrounding it, whether they should engage with it or try to deny that pessimistic outlook that the Seven Killer presents. It may be a little on the nose at times, but in those final decisive moments of the film, with the legendary twist, it comes to a head and manifests quite clearly and quite profoundly in that final back and forth between the two detectives and the killer, which is something that will stick with you. Even if you know the twist, it'll stick with you. All of these things make Seven, understandably, one of the most memorable films to come out of the 1990s, and it makes complete sense why it thrust David Fincher into the forefront of American filmmaking. It has such a uniquely bleak style of direction and storytelling that does not compromise. While it may come across as too blunt with how it conveys those ideas, the payoff at the end leaves you with enough to think about that it makes it stick with you after watching it.
Mark, give me the Zuck. I'll try my best to do it for you.
Social media has spread like a wildfire since the release of this film, and Mark Zuckerberg has gone on to have more controversies since the events of this film took place. But The Social Network encompasses the genius, the paranoia, and the shallow egoism behind it all. The Social Network follows the rise of Facebook and how it revolutionized social media today, while also using the relationships between the founders to explore the shift in social dynamics that it had brought on, presenting the rise through this heavily dramatized lens of two lawsuits, one between Mark and his co-founder, Eduardo, and the other with the Winklevoss twins. Both of these provide sharp, witty commentary on the events, and also build emphasis on others for dramatic effect. It captures the bitter end of a friendship and how it was driven apart by Mark's spiteful ambition. Jesse Eisenberg does an excellent job capturing Mark Zuckerberg and all his peculiar mannerism and his stone-faced snide remarks. It's not that he is entirely unlikable, he just becomes so infatuated with his own ambition, which is shown in the very opening of the film, where he and his girlfriend break up over his self-centeredness, among other crass comments. The dialogue over the whole film is pretty good and has that trademark Aaron Sorkin snarky humor written all over it. That works so well in this film, which brings me to another thing about this film that becomes very apparent from the opening, and that is how fast the dialogue is. Because holy shit, it's fucking fast. When I first watched this, it kind of bothered me how fast it was, because the dialogue was so good, it was just so hard to notice with how fast it was. But after going back and watching it again, I think the speed it's at doesn't ruin the experience for me in any way. And it made sense to me why they spoke in that, since the dialogue took place in this fast-paced lawsuit deposition, that it becomes kind of understandable, with the whole 179-page script being crammed into a 2-hour feature. I'm kind of impressed that he was able to pull that off with such speed without the pacing feeling rushed. I also gotta mention, since it's their first official collab, seeing Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross meeting David Fincher and being on point. Honest to God, this is probably one of his best soundtracks. Genuinely glad Reznor and Fincher started working together from this point on. It adds to the sleek and cynical feel the film has, yet the soundtrack is subtle and doesn't feel tacked on at all. The Social Network is an amazing. It captures the fast-moving world of technology at one of its most recent and most interesting crosspoints. It's also about the flawed humans at the center of it all, and their frail egos and blind thirst for power. And it's impressive that Fincher made something so timeless out of a timely event, and doing so with such bravado. It's an incredibly challenging thing to pull off, but this film, The Social Network, does it with such a sleek attitude that I can't help put it on number 2 on my list.
Stop.
Fight Club the game for PlayStation 2 is largely forgotten about by a mainstream audience. Released in 2004, it went on to become a cult classic, seeing some of its great weighty combat mechanics get some appreciation later on, yet executing it in such a fast-paced way, it really gives Tekken a run for its money. It even has Fred Durst for a playable character, so what more could you ask for? So I can entirely see why people love this game so much. It's fun and has plenty of gameplay variety, so there's no doubt it has earned its cult status, although I don't entirely understand why it is so panned upon release. Wait, there's a movie? Fight Club is literally me. It's about a depressed, insomnia-riddled insurance worker, played by Edward Norton, who, through meeting an anarchistic soap salesman Tyler Durden, enters into a world of chaos and aggression, making a bizarre farce out of the world around them with the clubs they found, which consists solely of one person fighting another. Fight Club is full of sharp cynicism and vulgar jabs at modern culture, a lot of which feel pretty relevant today. It feels very reminiscent of those adult graphic novels that were coming out at things like Spawn, The Boys, and so on and so forth. The humor is barbed with such darkness that it's hard not to notice. It has such an incredibly in-your-face attitude about it, where the narrator repeatedly breaks the fourth wall to explain some opinion he has on something in a crass and benign way. I'm not putting it down in any way. I think it's actually hilarious at times. It pokes fun at things we think are normal, but puts it in such a ridiculous way that it becomes funny. Be it the support groups the narrator visits at the beginning of the film, the insurance job he works, his choice in decor, or even the whole corporate work structure bullshit he has to deal with. It plays into this absurd interpretation of modern living, and I can't help but be enamored with it. The narration has so many weird motifs built into it that, despite being a large chunk of the film, never got annoying. The dynamic between Brad Pitt and Edward Norton is great, with the latter playing the more meek and pessimistic character, and the former being a chauvinist, hyper-aggressive free spirit who is hell-bent on destruction. And while these two seem like complete opposites, they have great chemistry together, and it almost feels as if they were two sides of the same coin. The film's presentation is incredibly well put together, even despite some indulgences reeking of the 90s, like the molecule-level close-ups that I mentioned in my Panic Room section, magnifying in on some items, which is a bit eye-rolling today, but the choices on its focus at least make it look like it was saying something more than it was in Panic Room. The visual style is very dark and gritty, with most of the scenes being captured in the dead of night or under harsh fluorescent lighting. The Dust Brothers soundtrack is also incredibly 90s as well, giving it a hip breakbeat industrial finish, which I also just happen to be a giant sucker for that whole thing, so I quite like how they use it throughout the film. All of this combines to make a film that is cool, slick, vulgar, and entirely relatable, especially the things it tackles with living as an adult in the modern world. Although talking about this film and its themes is kind of a litmus test, with two extremes of interpretations on the film, neither of which are wrong, by the way. One side decries it as an example of the harmful implications of toxic masculinity and how it leads men to self-destruction, while the other focuses on what self-destruction in the modern world looks like, pointing out all the flashy consumerism and certain ideas you are sold, like the concept of self-improvement and how it really is just masturbation. In actuality, both of these concepts are true about the film. They are just two parts that make the film's theme whole. Self-improvement is masturbation, but in the end, self-destruction, the kind that Tyler Durden worships, turns into the same overly complex, self-masturbatory system that he was trying to fight. A system that just wants to see the world burn to nothing. He wants to return man, or specifically men, towards their most primal instinct with no intended end goal of doing anything besides that. Basically, Tyler Durden wants to return to monkey. He wants a revolution, but only to see the world burn and not bring about any substantial change. So really, he was just selling these ideals without rebuilding it, or without even destroying anything substantial either. Yet with the ending, it plants the idea of what actual self-destruction entails, and actually rebuilding yourself looks like. All of these ideas are expressed so clearly with such an in-your-face attitude that I couldn't help but put it as my favorite David Fincher film. There are very few films that can pull off what this film does, expressing the jaded attitude of Gen X, but with such a large appeal that it can touch any generation of filmgoers, especially the jaded attitude of Gen Z. We really don't see this kind of film often. That's why it takes the cake as David Fincher's best film. It's him at his most maximal, with all the sarcastic wit, stylish cinematography, and pulsating techno music that you could ask for in a movie. What more could you ask for? Thank you for finishing this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If not, throw every insulting reason of why I'm wrong in the comments below. Alright, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!